Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss critical thinking, arguments. More specifically, we're going to talk about argument structure and its elements. Also, we're going to talk about assumptions, the very important but not spoken part of the argument. Also, examples of specific fallacies and how to identify them. So most academic writings tasks require you to make an argument, that is, to present reasons for a particular claim or interpretation you're putting forward. So when you interpret something or when you make a particular claim, you're actually forming an argument, especially if you provide reasons for that. You may have been told that you need to make your argument more logical and stronger, and you may have worried that you simply aren't a logical person or wondered what it means for an argument to be strong. Learning to make the best argument you can is an ongoing process. But it isn't impossible. Being logical is something anyone can do with practice. And that's exactly what we're going to learn. Each argument you make is composed of premises. This is a term for a statement that express your reasons or evidence. They are arranged in the right way to support your conclusion, the main claim or interpretation you're offering. So as you can see, arguments have structures, and usually those are premises and conclusions. Those are two most important parts of the argument. So let's see basic definitions. Logic is the science that evaluates arguments. An argument is a group of statements including one or more premises and one and only one conclusion. Do you remember? We just discussed that premises are reasons or evidence that are given for a certain interpretation or statement. Statement is a sentence that is either true or false, such as the cat is on the mat. Many sentences are not statements, such as close the door, please. How old are you? So, statement is a sentence either true or false. Okay, so that's what a statement is. A premise is a statement in an argument that provides reasons or support for the conclusion. There can be one or many premises in a single argument. So in one argument, we have one conclusion, but several premises. We can have several premises. Mostly good arguments have good premises, good support for their conclusion. Conclusion is a statement in an argument that indicates of what the arguer is trying to convince the reader or listener. What is the argument is trying to prove? There can be only one conclusion in a single argument. So there are certain words, most of the time those are linkers, that helps us identify that this is a premise and this is the conclusion. I remind you that premise is something that supports the conclusion, and those could be evidence or could be reasons. So if you see the words like since, in that, seeing that, as indicated by, maybe referred from, for the reason that, because, as, for, in as much as, for, given that, owing to, follows from, maybe derived from, maybe deduced from. The reason is that, in view of the fact that, as shown by, those are all indicators of premises. So most of the time when we see the premise, we see the reasons that the author gave us for having certain opinion or conclusion, we see those indicators, but not necessarily, not always. What about conclusion indicators? If we see the words or linkers or adverbs such as therefore, thus, hence, wherefore, consequently, whence, accordingly, we may infer that, so we may conclude it must be that, it follows that, entails that, proves that, implies that. In consequence, which means that, as a result, which shows that, I conclude that, which point to, which allows us to infer, which implies that, conclusion that. If we see those, most likely this is going to be the conclusion. But as we discussed, it's not always the case. Sometimes we can see the conclusion that's not given after these statements. So it could be slightly difficult to identify sometimes. And the conclusion could be sometimes the first statement, though we always expect it to be by the end of the statement. Therefore, conclusions are often something that we see a bit later in the argument, something that is derived from the premises. But like I said, it could be the first sentence too. If we try to imagine as a building, okay, then we have the assumptions, then we have premises, and finally we have the conclusion. And this is the structure of the argument. But what we have to be careful about is that the assumptions are you see, they're in brackets. So they're not always, let's say not always, directly stated in the passage. So normally we have to logically infer them. We can guess from the arguments and from the conclusion specifically what were the assumptions of the author. And we're going to discuss the assumptions because those are very important in critical thinking. So what are the assumptions? All arguments require assumptions. In a moment, we will look at the different types of assumptions with some examples. But first, a definition. An assumption is a claim that the author doesn't even try to prove. Sometimes we say that it's something that people take for granted. So it goes without saying. We never even think about that. We never even discuss that. It's just like it goes without saying. We just believe in that, and we don't spend time proving those arguments. And those are the assumptions. With some examples, but first a definition. We discussed that. It's a claim that the author doesn't even try to prove. So it's a claim that the author think about, but not necessarily say. Rather than proving the claim, the author simply assumes it is true. Remember, an assumption is not a point that the author tries to prove and fails. It's a point he or she doesn't even try to prove. So remember that the argument has the conclusion, right? And the conclusion is based on assumption. But the interesting thing is, normally the conclusion, the author always tried to prove, and he or she has the premises to do that. But the assumption is something where these premises or conclusion come from, but it's not really explicitly explained why it's true or not true. Assumptions and thesis, comparison and contrast. Here are two important ways that an assumption is like a thesis. An assumption can be proved and disproved. An assumption can be expressed only as a complete declarative sentence, not a question, not a word, a phrase, or fragments. So if you remember what a thesis is, when you write your essay, you have a thesis, right? So a thesis could be proven or disproven. And it could be only expressed as a declarative sentence or affirmative sentence, not a question, not a word or phrase. Let's go to the next one. Another way of saying that is both assumptions and these are claims, assertion of truth. Here are two ways that an assumption is not like a thesis. The author never tries to prove an assumption, whereas the author always tries to prove the thesis. Thesis is what the paper is aiming at, and assumption is what it starts from. I'm pretty sure you know the classic 5-paragraph essays where we usually announce in the beginning of the essay the thesis of the essay. The thesis is going to be the main idea that the author is trying to prove. So for example, if we have agree, disagree essay, we usually say, I completely agree, and then you usually state the main idea of your essay. Or you say, I completely disagree, or I partially agree, and so on and so forth. So that's what the thesis is in the essay. Whereas in the argument, if we have an assumption is never stated. It's usually, it's assumed, it's implied. It's something everybody takes for granted. It goes without saying. We never prove that. So let's see the types of assumptions. the assumptions can be explicit or implicit. So what is explicit is directly stated. So it's in the passage. Normally, the assumptions are not stated, but it is possible that some of the assumptions are directly stated in the passage. Implicit, that's often the case. They're implied. So they're not in the text, but it's easy to understand how the author got to a certain conclusion, and that's implicit. When you identify someone's assumptions, look for both kinds. So an explicit premise in a sample article is a statement. Stranded people like Hurricane Katrina were poor, Black, disproportionately elderly. The author states this, but makes no attempt to prove it, probably because she figures it's a well-established fact. No proof needed here. So the authors sometimes say the stranded were poor, Black, disproportionately elderly. So in this context, the author does not give specific numbers or statistics, or doesn't cite any reputable sources or previous articles. The author just gives this information without providing the proof, and that's an assumption. And in this context, it's an explicit assumption. So it's like actually stated in the passage. An implicit premise. An implicit premise, like you remember, yes? So it could be premises. Those are the reasons or evidence that support the conclusion. And sometimes we have implicit assumptions as a premise. So the premise. Implicit premise in the article is the assumption that racism is a bad thing. She never says this, and she certainly never tries to prove it, but it is basic to the point she's trying to make. So when the author assumes that racism is a bad thing, there is no need to prove that, right? It's something that most people would agree. And there is no need to prove that. And that's an assumption. Notice that an assumption can be, and often is, perfectly reasonable. Assumptions are not necessarily errors. They are an indispensable part of an argument, the bedrock on which it rests. So what we have to remember is that most of the time when we hear the word assumption, we think of something bad. People usually say that, and you would hear that from your friends maybe sometimes. Don't make assumptions. Like, people don't like being, being put into certain broad category, labeled as something. And assumption is that, right? It's stereotypes are assumptions. So we believe about certain things about certain people, like people who are wearing glasses are nice or smart, and that's an assumption. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just something that our brain does. And a lot of times when we are building our arguments, we have our own assumptions that we never explicitly tell to everyone. We just believe that everybody would understand it and accept it. Assumption can be either factual, analytical, or moral, based on values. Some assumptions deal with facts, like statements, all men are mortal. Or let's think of another assumption, like the earth is round, right? That's an assumption that we all have. And we don't necessarily need to, every time we say the sun revolves around the earth, we don't need to prove this fact. Everybody knows that it's true. Therefore, we don't need to prove that. We don't need to say there were some research that were proven, or we can see it from space that the earth is not flat, it's round. We don't need to prove that. And that's an assumption we all make, something we learned at school. So some assumptions deal with fact, like statements, all men are mortal, or the earth is round. or sun revolves around Earth. Other assumptions are analytical. They are based on facts, but they go a step further in making some sort of statements about those facts, interpreting them, analyzing them, explaining them, and evaluating them. So analytical are going to give us